Rich woman insults veteran's family medal, then he shares its story. Claire Prescott's world was a carefully curated one, a realm where appearances mattered above all else, and where beauty, wealth, and social standing were the pillars upon which her life rested. Born into a family of old money privilege, Claire had never known a life outside of luxury. Raised in a sprawling mansion on a hill overlooking Los Angeles, she had inherited not just the wealth of her ancestors, but their tastes and sensibilities as well. She was a product of this world, and it defined every aspect of her existence, from her daily routines to the way she interacted with the world around her. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. For Claire, comfort meant stability, and stability meant the ability to control every aspect of her life. This control extended to her appearance, her relationships, and even her surroundings. Her wardrobe was a testament to her impeccable taste, full of custom-tailored designer pieces from the most coveted fashion houses, Chanel, Dior, Valentino. Each item was carefully selected not just for its quality, but for the statement it made. Claire was a woman of substance, refined and untouchable, and she wanted everyone to know it. In every room she entered, whether it was a grand ballroom at a charity gala or an intimate dinner party in her own home, Claire stood out, not because of her personality necessarily, but because of the unmistakable aura of elegance she projected. Her home, an architectural masterpiece in the heart of Bel Air, was another reflection of her life's carefully maintained image. The walls of the mansion were adorned with priceless artwork, abstract pieces by contemporary masters, large portraits of her ancestors in ornate frames. The furniture was tastefully minimal, each piece chosen with a discerning eye for its beauty and sophistication. Guests who visited often marveled at the space, remarking on the way it seemed to effortlessly combine modern style with timeless grace. Claire took great pride in these observations. She liked being the center of attention, and in a world that revered wealth and aesthetics, she thrived. In this world, Claire was the epitome of what everyone aspired to be, a woman of grace and wealth, a symbol of success. Her circle of friends consisted of other affluent socialites, celebrities, artists, and philanthropists, all of whom shared the same values and interests. They spoke of travel to exotic locales, the latest fashion trends, the most exclusive restaurants and bars, and the high-profile charity galas they attended. Conversations were laced with name-dropping, light humor, and an undercurrent of competition as each guest sought to outdo the other with tales of their latest achievements and acquisitions. Everything in Claire's world was curated, from the art on her walls to the conversations at her dinner table. She had perfected the art of navigating this space, making connections, charming the right people, and remaining ever present at the social events that defined her status. It was a life of predictability, of knowing exactly what to expect from every interaction and event. Claire felt secure in this world, even if sometimes the security came with a sense of emptiness she couldn't name. She had everything she could ever want, except, perhaps, a deeper sense of purpose. There were no real surprises in her life. Everything was as it should be, and she prided herself on her ability to keep it that way. Her role in society was well-defined, and her place in the world was unshakable. There was comfort in knowing that she was part of something bigger, part of a world that valued her for her beauty, her intellect, and her lineage. But underneath this pristine surface, there was a tension Claire had never fully acknowledged. It wasn't that she was unhappy, far from it. Her life was filled with the kinds of luxuries that others only dreamt of, and her days were filled with the routine of high society events and meetings with influential figures. It was just that, on occasion, she felt something was missing. It wasn't an obvious void, but more of an undercurrent, a feeling that, perhaps, she wasn't as fulfilled as she could be. Her friends, her social circle, and even her career as a socialite, these were all things she had built carefully and methodically. And yet, in quiet moments, usually when she was alone, Claire couldn't shake the nagging sense that there was more to life than this carefully constructed existence. Still, this feeling was easy to dismiss. After all, When your world is as grand and immovable as Claire's, the small cracks and fissures go unnoticed, or are at least easily papered over. She had never experienced real hardship. There was no real hunger, no loneliness that could pierce the facade of her life. She had never had to work for her money or fight for her place in the world. Everything was handed to her, and in exchange, she delivered the polished, impeccable version of herself that was expected. This life, though sometimes empty, was also safe, and Claire felt no need to rock the boat. What would be the point? She had everything anyone could possibly want: her beauty, her wealth, her impeccable social standing. What more could a person need? It was in this context, with her world firmly in place and her identity securely nestled within the structures of her privileged life, that Claire found herself at an art gallery opening one evening, surrounded by the usual crowd of celebrities and wealthy philanthropists. The gallery, a sleek modern space filled with controversial contemporary art, was the ideal venue for Claire to display her poise and sophisticated taste. It was a place where she could mingle with the cultural elite, speak about her latest acquisitions, and be seen in the right circles. Her role in this world was defined. She was there to look beautiful, to make the right connections, and to maintain her position at the top of the social ladder. Everything felt perfectly in place. As Claire entered the gallery, she made her rounds, exchanging pleasantries with friends and acquaintances, admiring the artwork, and enjoying the luxury of being surrounded by the most refined things life had to offer. The room hummed with the sound of clinking glasses and laughter as people moved from one art piece to the next, analyzing, commenting, and judging. To Claire, it was all rather amusing. She could tell when someone was feigning interest in a piece just to look sophisticated, just as she herself had perfected the art of feigning interest when necessary. It was a game, but one in which Claire excelled. There was no genuine curiosity about the art itself, only about the social game being played. And yet, amid the polished world Claire inhabited, there was something, or someone, that caught her attention. Near the back of the room, standing quietly by a sculpture, was an elderly man who seemed entirely out of place. His clothes, though neat, were nothing like the designer outfits that surrounded him. He wore a simple suit, one that looked like it had been tailored decades ago, and hanging from his neck was a faded, worn medal. To Claire, it looked entirely out of place among the sleek, modern artwork that surrounded it. It was exactly the kind of thing she would have labeled tacky, a relic from a bygone era that had no place in a contemporary art gallery. The man stood there, almost invisible in the crowd, except for the glint of the metal that caught her eye. Without thinking, Claire's sharp wit took over. She nudged a nearby friend and whispered loud enough for several people around her to hear. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, with a mocking smile. "Tacky, isn't it? What's he doing here, wearing that relic?" Her words were coated in the same polished veneer she used in every social setting, designed to amuse and elevate her at the expense of someone else. But the insult wasn't just about the man's attire. It was a reflection of Claire's larger worldview, one that deemed anything outside of her comfortable, well-ordered life as tacky or insignificant. She didn't expect anyone to challenge her opinion. She was Claire Prescott, after all, and her world had always bent to her will. But the moment her words left her lips, she noticed something. The elderly man, the one she had dismissed so easily, had heard her. He had turned, meeting her gaze with a calm and steady expression. There was no outrage, no defensiveness, just a quiet, almost knowing look that disarmed her. In that moment, Claire had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to be upended. This encounter, this seemingly inconsequential moment, would be the start of a transformation Claire had never anticipated. What seemed like a simple social faux pas would soon open a door to a world she had never understood, a world where real courage, sacrifice, and legacy existed, far beyond the surface-level trappings of art, wealth, and social status. And in that world, Claire would come face to face with something far more valuable than any designer label or piece of contemporary art. The story of a man who wore his history proudly, a history that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. At the core of Claire Prescott's carefully constructed life was a singular, almost obsessive desire to be admired, to be seen as flawless, to remain untouchable in the eyes of others. This was not simply the need to be liked or the desire to fit in, it was a deeper, almost existential need to define herself as something special, something that transcended the ordinary. In a world that operated on the currency of status, beauty, and wealth, Claire had mastered the art of standing out. And that, she believed, was her greatest strength. From a young age, Claire had been taught the value of her appearance, her lineage, and her ability to move effortlessly through the circles of the rich and powerful. Her parents had instilled in her an understanding that appearance was everything. They had lived through eras where image was directly tied to power and influence, where an invitation to the right parties or the proper representation at events meant the difference between thriving and fading into obscurity. Her mother, a glamorous socialite in her own right, had often said, "The world sees only what you choose to show them." This mantra had shaped Claire's approach to life. In her eyes, the world was a stage, and she was its leading lady. From the clothes she wore to the way she spoke, Claire's life was meticulously crafted to reflect perfection. There was no room for flaws in her image. She had learned to smile just the right way, to laugh just the right way, to make others feel as though they were the most important people in a room, all while carefully guarding the boundaries of her personal life. Everything she did was designed to reinforce her image as a woman who had it all, a woman who didn't need anything because she already had everything. Yet, as much as Claire relished the role she played, she couldn't deny the small seed of doubt that occasionally sprouted in her mind. It wasn't something she dwelled on for long, and she quickly dismissed it whenever it came up, but there were moments when she questioned the validity of her own life. Was she happy? Was she truly fulfilled? Or had she spent so many years crafting an image of perfection that she had forgotten to check whether it was real? But Claire wasn't one to dwell on such thoughts. When the doubts crept in, she buried them with another expensive piece of jewelry, a lavish vacation, or a new social event to attend. There was always something to distract her, always another way to reinforce the idea that she had everything she could ever need. That night at the art gallery was one of those occasions when the doubts began to creep in. As Claire moved through the crowd, accepting compliments and smiling graciously, she found herself momentarily lost in the noise of it all. The gallery was filled with works by renowned artists, each piece more abstract and avant-garde than the last. The crowd around her buzzed with intellectual conversation, discussing the deeper meanings behind each piece, some pretending to understand what the artists were trying to convey, others genuinely engaging in critiques. Claire, however, felt a subtle disconnection. The art, though beautiful in its own way, seemed foreign to her, detached from the reality of her own life. In this world of art, beauty, and refinement, Claire excelled. She was part of the elite, the chosen few, whose opinions mattered. But what was the real value of all this? As her eyes moved across the various paintings and sculptures, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were all just distractions. Beautiful distractions, no doubt, but distractions nonetheless. Her friends, too, seemed caught up in the game of appearances. Every conversation was a contest of who could talk about the latest, the rarest, the most exclusive things they had seen or done. The social validation they all sought was undeniable, and Claire, though comfortable in her role as the center of attention, began to feel as though there was something missing, something that the galleries, the designer gowns, and the celebrities couldn't fill. This discomfort was fleeting, of course. She quickly shifted her focus to other things. The soft clink of wine glasses, the chatter of her friends about a new restaurant opening in Beverly Hills, the latest charity auction where she had purchased yet another priceless painting for her collection. She pushed the doubt aside with the reflexive ease of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of avoidance. She had her life, a perfect, pristine life, and that was enough. At least, it should have been enough. But then she saw him, the elderly man, standing near the back of the gallery, unnoticed by most, but impossible for Claire to ignore. He was a figure out of place in a room filled with wealth, culture, and sophistication. His presence seemed like an anomaly in this world of carefully curated beauty and exclusivity. His attire was simple, almost antiquated. His suit, while neat, was far from the high fashion that filled the room, and hanging from his neck was a medal, old, worn, and completely out of step with the modern aesthetic surrounding them. Claire, for all her sophistication, couldn't help but judge him instantly. The man had no business being here. This wasn't a place for relics of the past. This was a space for the future, an avant-garde space where new ideas, new visions, and new trends took center stage. The past had no place here, and this man, with his antique medal, was an unwelcome intrusion. She barely registered the name of the man, Albert. She would later learn, but the first thing that came to her mind when she saw him was that he looked tacky. He was the antithesis of everything Claire had come to believe about the world. His appearance felt like a direct challenge to the image she had so carefully built over the years. There was something almost jarring about the way he stood there, seemingly oblivious to the beauty around him, like a ghost from another era wandering into the future. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the man from across the room. Her natural instinct was to dismiss him, to put him in the category of things she didn't need to bother with. He didn't belong here, and the old, faded medal hanging around his neck only confirmed it. She didn't know the first thing about the man, but in her world, appearances mattered far more than the substance behind them. This man, to her, was a relic of a bygone time, something unnecessary in a world of high fashion, cultural elites, and intellectual discourse. And that medal? It was nothing more than an eyesore. She whispered to her friend beside her, her voice laced with a knowing edge. "Look at that," she said, nodding in his direction. "How tacky. What on earth is he doing here, wearing that medal?" It was meant as a light-hearted observation, but there was a sharpness to her tone, a criticism of something that didn't fit the mold she had worked so hard to construct around herself. He's probably one of those old men who think that the past still matters. Can't seem to let go of it. Her friend, a woman named Margot, glanced over at Albert but didn't respond immediately. She was a little more sensitive to the art world than Claire, and while she often played along with Claire's sharper jabs at the less polished aspects of life, she hesitated. "Maybe it's a war medal?" Margot suggested tentatively, though she didn't seem entirely convinced by her own words. Claire scoffed lightly, the disdain clear in her voice. "Oh, please. What's a war medal doing at an art gallery? This is a place for contemporary artists, not for people stuck in the past." She took another sip of her champagne, fully expecting Margot to agree with her. That was the beauty of Claire's world. Everyone around her existed to reinforce her carefully constructed image, to flatter her opinions, to make her feel right. But there was something about this man, about the way he wore the medal, that lingered in Claire's mind. His presence was so starkly different from everything in the room that, for the first time in years, Claire began to feel a vague sense of discomfort. She pushed it aside, of course. The discomfort was fleeting. She was above such things. Still, she couldn't shake the thought that something about this man, this relic from another time, was challenging the very foundation of her world. The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it came. The next moment, Claire was caught up in the chatter of the gallery once more, accepting compliments, nodding along to conversations, and basking in the admiration of the people around her. She was back in control. She had everything she wanted, everything she needed to maintain her place at the top of this world. And for a while, that was enough. But, as fate would have it, this fleeting moment of discomfort would soon lead her into a situation that would shake her carefully guarded world to its core. Claire Prescott had spent most of her life avoiding situations that threatened her carefully constructed sense of self. She thrived on control, on knowing what to expect from every interaction, every gathering, every glance cast her way. But life, as it often does, has a way of shaking the foundations of even the most secure walls, and the world Claire had so perfectly curated was about to be disrupted in a way she hadn't anticipated. The moment Albert caught her eye at the art gallery, Claire felt something shift inside her, a subtle unease that she quickly dismissed but couldn't entirely ignore. That quiet discomfort from before now gnawed at her as the evening wore on. She had tried to move past it, but the memory of his worn-out medal, the way he seemed so out of place, kept resurfacing in her thoughts. And though Claire would never admit it to herself, a small part of her felt unsettled by the very existence of this man. Albert's quiet presence in the gallery had disrupted the surface-level elegance she was so used to. He didn't play the game in the way everyone else did. There was no polished smile, no social veneer. He wasn't there to fit in. He was simply there, with no regard for the expectations of the people around him. And that, Claire realized, was what bothered her the most. He didn't need to impress anyone. He didn't care if he was accepted, admired, or even understood. He was completely outside the boundaries of her world. The more she thought about him, the more she found herself irritated by his presence. Why was he wearing that medal? Was he meant to invoke sympathy? Was it a ploy to gain attention? These questions lingered in her mind as the evening wore on. But despite her internal protests, there was an undeniable curiosity that had begun to take root. She could not stop wondering about this man and his story. Why was he so indifferent to the social dynamics around him? Why had he chosen to wear something so blatantly out of place? Her irritation gave way to a more complex feeling, something akin to guilt. It was not as though she was unfamiliar with veterans or stories of bravery. She had attended fundraisers, charity galas, and auctions meant to support military families and veterans. But those were always in the context of polished speeches, moving photos, and perfectly composed stories designed to elicit a donation. It was easy to care about veterans in abstract terms, to contribute to causes in a way that didn't require personal engagement. It was easy to feel sympathy for a group when they were part of a well-defined narrative. Albert, however, wasn't part of a charity or a cause. He was simply a man standing in front of her, in the flesh, unpolished and unassuming. His presence was an interruption, a challenge to the easy comforts of Claire's well-ordered life. She had to admit, even to herself, that she wasn't sure how to process him. This wasn't a situation she could control, and that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. It was at this moment that she made the decision to approach him. She had no real reason for it, no plan other than the need to understand. Maybe, she thought, she could satisfy her curiosity and regain her sense of control. She was Claire Prescott, after all. If there was one thing she was certain of, it was that she could navigate any social situation, no matter how awkward or unfamiliar. So, she pushed through her reservations and, with a practiced smile, made her way across the room. Albert, for his part, didn't notice her immediately. He was standing by a large painting, his eyes fixed on it with a quiet intensity that struck Claire as odd. The gallery was crowded, and most people were milling about, but Albert stood apart from the crowd, almost like he was in another world altogether. Claire had to clear her throat before he finally turned to look at her. "Hello," she said, her voice smooth but with a faint edge of curiosity. "I couldn't help but notice your medal. It's quite unique." Albert's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no surprise in his expression, just a quiet acknowledgement. "It is," he said simply, his tone steady but not overly warm. Claire tried to maintain her composure. "It's rare, isn't it? I don't think I've ever seen something like it before." "That's because it's not meant to be seen," Albert replied, his voice calm but carrying a weight that seemed to draw Claire in. She felt her pulse quicken. She had expected some explanation, some rehearsed answer about how the medal symbolized valor or sacrifice, or how it represented a chapter of history that was worth remembering. But his response was different. It was almost dismissive of the very notion of recognition. Albert's calm demeanor felt foreign to Claire, whose life had always revolved around recognition, appearances, and outward approval. It was unsettling to be faced with someone who didn't need to be seen, who wasn't interested in being admired, and yet wore his history with a quiet dignity that somehow demanded respect. "Not meant to be seen?" she echoed, a little caught off guard. "What do you mean by that?" Albert took a step back from the painting and looked at her directly. There was something in his eyes, something that Claire couldn't immediately place. It wasn't condescension or disdain, it was more like an invitation. He wasn't offering her a story or a piece of history. He was offering her something more personal, something that might reveal the layers of a man who had lived through far more than any of them could understand. "It's not for the people who don't know what it means," he said slowly. It's for the people who do, and for the people who need it. Claire felt an inexplicable tug at her chest. There was something heavy about his words, something deeper than she was prepared for. She had always been so careful with the way she presented herself, with the way she lived her life. She had curated every part of her existence to avoid anything that might make her uncomfortable, anything that might force her to confront something she wasn't ready to face. But Albert was different. He wasn't offering her a story she could simply absorb and move on from. He was offering her an experience, something far beyond the shallow, surface-level interactions Claire was accustomed to. "I'm not sure I understand," Claire said, her voice faltering slightly despite her efforts to sound composed. Albert regarded her for a long moment, his gaze unflinching. "You will," he replied, his voice so steady and sure that Claire felt a chill run through her. There was something in his words, something in the way he looked at her, that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. For a moment, Claire stood there in silence, trying to process what had just transpired. She had expected an explanation, something that would allow her to walk away with a neat little package of understanding, something she could slot into the box of her carefully ordered life. But Albert had given her nothing of the sort. Instead, he had opened a door to something messy, something real. It was as though she had stepped out of the well-trodden path of her own existence and into an unknown world where control was no longer hers. And that was when it happened. The realization. The brief but unmistakable flash of vulnerability that flickered in her chest. For all her wealth, her status, her control, Claire had never truly known sacrifice. She had never faced hardship in the way Albert had, never experienced the weight of history or the depth of personal loss that had shaped him. She had spent her life avoiding anything that might force her to confront the fragility of existence, avoiding anything that might reveal her own imperfections. But Albert, in his quiet dignity, had done just that. This wasn't a conversation about art. This wasn't about social status or admiration. This was about something far deeper, something that Claire had never had to face before. And now, in that moment, standing in the presence of this man who wore his history with such quiet strength, she realized that she had been living in a bubble. A beautiful, carefully constructed bubble, but a bubble nonetheless. "I think I need to understand more," Claire said softly, almost to herself, though Albert heard her clearly. He nodded, as though he had been expecting her to say those words. "I can tell you the story," he said, "but you'll need to listen. And if you listen closely enough, you may hear the truth." With that, Claire's world, which had once seemed so neatly contained and controlled, began to shift. The moment she stepped out of her carefully curated life and ventured into the world of someone like Albert, she unknowingly began the process of changing forever. The shift had been subtle at first, just a flicker of discomfort that Claire could easily brush aside. But the more she thought about Albert, the more she found herself replaying their brief interaction in her mind. The simplicity of his words, the unshakable certainty with which he had spoken, gnawed at her. In all her years of attending galas, mingling with the most powerful, influential people, she had never once encountered a situation like this. This wasn't the world of carefully constructed facades, polished smiles, and superficial compliments. This was something raw and unfiltered, a reality Claire wasn't prepared for, but could not escape. After their conversation, Claire had tried to rejoin the flow of the evening. She mingled with her friends and attempted to steer the conversation back to the usual topics: fashion, art, charity events. But something was different. Her mind kept wandering back to Albert, his quiet strength, and the way his presence had disrupted her perfect world. The more she pushed it away, the more persistent the feeling became. It was as though his presence had broken through the protective walls she had built around herself, and now there was no easy way to ignore it. It wasn't just the metal that bothered her. It was the implication that, somehow, the life she had built, a life of wealth, status, and outward success, was shallow in comparison to the depth that Albert seemed to embody. She had always believed that success was about appearances, about controlling your environment and making others see you as flawless. But Albert was the antithesis of that. He didn't care about appearances, about fitting in or impressing anyone. And that was what made her uncomfortable. His indifference to social expectations was both liberating and unsettling. It was as if he existed in a different dimension, one in which the things that Claire had spent her life obsessing over were irrelevant. The more Claire thought about it, the more she realized how little she truly understood about life beyond her bubble. She had always been surrounded by people who shared her values, people who valued wealth, power, and influence. These were the things that had defined her existence for as long as she could remember. But now, in the wake of her encounter with Albert, Claire found herself questioning the foundation of it all. Had she been living a life of true fulfillment? Or had she simply been playing a part in a game she never fully understood? For the first time in years, Claire felt uncertain, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel since childhood. She had prided herself on her ability to control every situation, to be the one who set the rules and made the decisions. But Albert had stripped that away, exposing her to something far more complex and, frankly, more terrifying. The idea that her life, as she had constructed it, might be hollow. The reality of this possibility was something Claire had avoided confronting for a long time. But now it was impossible to ignore. Days passed, and Claire found herself thinking about Albert and his story more frequently. She began to question the things she had always taken for granted: the importance of status, the endless pursuit of material wealth, the constant need for approval. What was it all for? She had everything that society told her she should want. She had money, beauty, influence. And yet, in the presence of a man who had none of these things, yet seemed to possess a kind of quiet dignity that she had never experienced, she felt small. It wasn't just about the medal anymore. It was about the life Albert had lived and the wisdom he seemed to carry with him. A wisdom she couldn't quite fathom. Claire's internal conflict reached a boiling point when she received an invitation to another high-profile charity event. It was the kind of event she never missed, an evening full of powerful people, influential figures from the world of art, politics, and business. It was exactly the kind of gathering Claire thrived in. And yet, as the event loomed closer, Claire felt herself dragging her feet. She wasn't excited about it the way she once had been. There was a weight on her chest that she couldn't shake, a nagging sense that this next gala, this next glittering display of wealth and status, wasn't going to give her the same satisfaction it once had. She had attended countless such events over the years, but now they felt like hollow performances rather than meaningful experiences. It was then that Claire made a decision. Instead of attending the gala as she normally would, dressed to the nines, playing the part of the charming socialite, she would take a different approach. She would visit Albert. She needed to know more about the man who had so thoroughly disrupted her life. There was something about him that demanded her attention, something that felt more real than anything she had experienced in years. On the night of the gala, Claire drove to the address Albert had given her. She was nervous, more nervous than she had been for any of the countless parties she had attended in the past. She was not accustomed to feeling vulnerable or uncertain. Yet here she was about to enter a world she barely understood. As she arrived at the address, she was struck by the contrast between the sleek, modern buildings of downtown Los Angeles and the more modest, older neighborhood where Albert lived. It was quiet and unassuming, nothing like the ostentatious displays of wealth she was accustomed to. This, she realized, was the world Albert inhabited, a world that didn't require approval or admiration from anyone else. Albert greeted her at the door with the same quiet dignity he had displayed at the gallery. His home was modest, filled with old photographs, war memorabilia, and books that seemed to tell stories of a life lived with purpose. There was no pretension, no polished surfaces or designer furniture, just a home that felt lived in, full of history. Claire couldn't help but feel like an intruder as she stepped inside, as if she were trespassing into a world that had no place for someone like her. "Come in," Albert said, his voice warm but not overly inviting. "I don't have much, but I'm happy to share what I can." Claire followed him inside, her mind buzzing with questions she didn't know how to ask. As she sat down at his modest kitchen table, she took in the room around her. The faded photographs on the walls, the yellowed letters and maps that seemed to speak of distant wars and long-lost time periods. There was no pretense here, no need to impress. Albert's life had been lived with a quiet, unassuming dignity that Claire couldn't fully comprehend. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he began to speak of his past, of the wars he had fought in, the people he had lost, and the lessons he had learned along the way. Claire listened, captivated despite herself. His stories were not the kind of tales she was used to hearing at charity events, where speakers recounted sanitized versions of history designed to inspire donations and applause. Albert's stories were real, raw and painful, but also full of profound wisdom. He spoke of sacrifice, loss, and the things that truly mattered in life, things Claire had never fully understood until now. There was no grand narrative, no heroic speeches, just the quiet, steady voice of a man who had lived through unimaginable hardship and emerged with a deep understanding of what it meant to be human. He spoke of comrades he had lost in battle, of moments of profound fear and courage, and of the quiet dignity of simply surviving when so many others had not. He didn't try to make Claire feel guilty for her own life. He didn't need to. The weight of his words was enough to force her to confront her own choices. As the evening wore on, Claire felt something begin to shift within her. The walls she had so carefully built around herself, walls of status, wealth, and approval, seemed to crumble, piece by piece. She had spent so much of her life focusing on the superficial, on the things that could be measured by the world's standards. But Albert had shown her a different way of living, a life defined not by wealth or influence, but by quiet dignity, sacrifice, and the things that truly mattered. By the time she left Albert's home that night, Claire was no longer the same person who had entered. She was still Claire Prescott, still a woman of wealth and status, but something fundamental had changed. She had seen life through a different lens, one that made her question the very foundations of her existence. As Claire sat in the car on her way home, the streets of Los Angeles stretching out before her, she felt a deep sense of clarity. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to be perfect or flawless. What mattered now was authenticity. It was the ability to connect with others, to live a life that wasn't defined by external validation, but by the depth of one's character. The world she had once dominated, the world of glittering social events and endless pursuit of wealth, suddenly seemed far less important. Claire had begun to understand something far more valuable, and it was only the beginning of her transformation. When Claire first arrived at Albert's modest home, she hadn't fully understood what she was seeking. There had been a vague, nagging feeling inside her, an unsettling awareness that her life, with all its wealth, social circles, and control, was somehow incomplete. Albert had offered her something unexpected, a glimpse into a world where the surface didn't matter, a world where true dignity was measured not by social status or public acclaim, but by something much deeper: sacrifice, quiet resilience, and authenticity. Claire had listened, absorbed his stories, and felt a sense of relief in the simplicity of his wisdom. But now, as the weeks passed, she began to tell herself that this was it, that she had finally found the answers she had been searching for. Or at least that she could. The night at Albert's home had been profound, no doubt, but it had also left Claire with a hunger for something concrete, something she could grasp and hold on to. Albert's world, although deeply insightful, was foreign and uncomfortable. The more Claire thought about it, the more she realized how much she longed to reconcile her own life with the values Albert had shared. She wanted to change, to somehow live more authentically. But how? What did that even look like for someone like her? How could she live in a world that was built on appearances, influence, and wealth, and still hold onto the lessons Albert had imparted? It wasn't long before Claire's attempt to reconcile these two worlds manifested in a new course of action. She had been invited to another prestigious gala, a glittering event to benefit wounded veterans. The guest list was filled with people from the highest echelons of society, the kinds of people she had known her entire life. But this time, something felt different. She no longer felt the overwhelming desire to flaunt her success, to charm the room, or to seek approval from her peers. No, Claire was determined to do something else, to use this occasion to make a statement, to show that she could live authentically without abandoning the world she knew. This time, she would wear her father's World War II medal, the one she had inherited and never truly understood. It would be her way of honoring Albert's lessons, of showing the world that she too could hold onto something real, something that mattered beyond the veneer of wealth and privilege. The gala was set in an opulent ballroom, bathed in chandeliers and adorned with silk drapes. As Claire stepped out of her car, she could already feel the weight of expectations bearing down on her, but this time, she felt equipped to handle it. For the first time in years, she was determined to break free from the polished, manufactured version of herself she had been playing for so long. She would make a point to honor the values Albert had shared with her, without betraying who she was or the world she belonged to. Claire had spent weeks preparing for this moment. She had carefully chosen an elegant gown, one that was understated yet regal. Her hair was styled in a simple yet graceful updo. But it wasn't the gown or the jewelry that mattered. No, it was the medal she now wore around her neck, her father's World War II commendation, an heirloom that represented something beyond material wealth. It was a symbol of sacrifice, honor, and the kind of quiet dignity that Albert had embodied. The moment she clipped the medal into place, Claire felt a strange sense of power surge through her. She could already imagine the looks of admiration she would receive. It wasn't just the people at the gala who would recognize her for wearing it. It was as if, by draping the medal over her neck, she could claim a new identity, one that was more genuine, more profound than the one she had carried before. The gala unfolded just as Claire had expected, laughter, clinking glasses, and compliments flowing as easily as the champagne. People nodded approvingly as she made her way through the crowd, but now, something was different. Claire felt the eyes on her, but it wasn't the same. She wasn't just another socialite in a lavish gown. She was someone who carried with her the weight of history, someone who had shown that she understood the true meaning of honor and sacrifice. The evening unfolded in a blur of pleasantries, handshakes, and obligatory small talk. Yet Claire couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was missing. Despite the admiring glances, despite the fact that everyone seemed to appreciate the fact that she was wearing her father's medal, Claire couldn't rid herself of the sinking feeling that this new version of herself, this carefully curated display of authenticity, wasn't as satisfying as she had hoped. It was during the main ceremony, as the host stepped up to the podium to give the keynote speech, that the realization hit her. The evening's message was clear. It was a celebration of veterans, of real sacrifice and courage in the face of adversity. And as she stood in the back of the room, admiring the speaker and the many veterans who had come to tell their stories, Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness wash over her. She had done what she thought would make her feel like she truly understood, truly belonged in the world that Albert had shown her. She had worn the medal, she had played the part, and she had listened, so why did she feel so disconnected? As the evening wore on, Claire realized that the medal, despite its historical significance, wasn't the answer. It wasn't enough to simply wear something as a symbol of honor. She had been hoping for some magical transformation, a shortcut to feeling authentic and connected. But the truth was more complex, and it stung. Albert's life had been built on the substance of experience, the weight of loss, the camaraderie forged in the trenches, the deep understanding of what it meant to sacrifice for something greater than oneself. Claire's life, by comparison, was built on the surface: wealth, power, and influence. These things might give the illusion of meaning, but they didn't offer the depth that Albert's stories had. And wearing the medal didn't change that. Her mind wandered back to Albert's words. It's not for the people who don't know what it means. It's for the people who do. She had hoped, when she put on that medal, that she could finally understand. That somehow, by simply embodying a symbol of sacrifice, she could prove she was part of something greater. But now, in the midst of the glittering gala, surrounded by people who clinked glasses in shallow camaraderie, she realized the painful truth. Wearing the medal wasn't enough. It didn't make her sacrifice the way Albert had. It didn't make her understand loss, or history, or even the quiet dignity that had marked his life. The applause broke through her thoughts as the keynote speaker finished his speech, and a wave of admiration swept through the crowd. Claire clapped along with everyone else, but the sound felt hollow in her ears. The evening, once full of promise and new understanding, felt meaningless now. She had tried to fit herself into a mold that wasn't hers, believing that she could somehow merge the world of status and privilege with the world Albert had shared with her. But the reality was far more complicated. She left the gala early, excusing herself with vague words about a prior commitment. But even as she walked away from the event, she knew that she was not walking away from the lesson. She was walking away from her mistaken belief that external symbols, external actions, could change her life. It was not enough to simply wear a medal. To live authentically, to live in the way Albert had, would require something far deeper, a shift in her very understanding of what mattered, of what it meant to live with honor, to live with sacrifice, and to live with dignity. As Claire drove home that night, the streets of Los Angeles seemed less glittering, less dazzling than they had before. The world she had once dominated, the world of wealth, influence, and approval, suddenly felt more like a prison. It was as though the walls she had built around herself were closing in. She had achieved what she thought she wanted: approval, recognition, the external validation of her actions. But it hadn't brought the satisfaction she had hoped for. The reality of her victory was that it had been a false one. In the end, Claire realized that she hadn't gotten what she truly wanted at all. The medal, the appearance of authenticity, the recognition, it had all been a superficial attempt to satisfy a deeper hunger. She had thought that by wearing the medal, she could embody the life she had seen in Albert. But in doing so, she had missed the point entirely. The days following the gala felt like a series of disconnected moments for Claire. Each one seemed to emphasize just how hollow her attempts at authenticity had been. She had believed, even hoped, that wearing her father's World War II medal and trying to incorporate some of Albert's quiet dignity into her persona would somehow bring peace. Instead, she felt as though her actions had created more questions than answers. The glittering world she had once so easily dominated now seemed more like a stage upon which Claire was no longer certain of her role. It was the conversations after the gala that unsettled her the most. Among her high society friends, the talk had quickly turned to the success of the charity event, and Claire found herself swept into a conversation where her choice to wear the medal was praised and dissected in equal measure. Some guests had expressed admiration for her unexpected gesture. It had become the talking point of the evening. "Such a lovely tribute to your father's legacy," they said. It really added a personal touch to the gala. But as Claire listened to the praise, she felt a deep, gnawing discomfort that she couldn't shake. The words of praise weren't for the true meaning of the medal, of what it symbolized, but rather for how it had looked on her. It was as though she had become a mere vessel for something meaningful, rather than someone who truly understood it. The recognition felt more like a validation of her external actions than an acknowledgement of any internal change or understanding. People weren't applauding the sacrifice the medal represented. They were applauding her for having the foresight to wear it, for playing the part in a way that seemed charming and appropriate. This realization hit Claire hard. She had been so sure that the external symbol of the medal would transform her life and bring her a deeper understanding of the world Albert had shared with her. Instead, it had merely fed into the shallow spectacle of high society, a world where appearances were more important than true understanding. People didn't care about the meaning behind the medal, they cared about the impression it created. And this bitter truth stung Claire more than she cared to admit. The first time she truly felt the weight of her misguided choice came the morning after the gala, when she received an unexpected phone call. It was from her father's old friend, Victor Simmons, a fellow veteran who had fought alongside him during the war. Victor was in his late 80s, still sharp in his mind but frail in body. He had always been a figure of strength in Claire's life, one of the few people who spoke openly about the true sacrifices of war, about the price of honor, and the heavy burdens carried by those who fought for freedom. He was someone Claire had admired deeply, but in recent years, their relationship had become more distant, relegated to occasional phone calls and holiday greetings. "Claire, I saw you at the gala last night," Victor said in his gravelly voice. "I saw you wearing your father's medal. There was a pause, a moment of silence, before Claire responded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, Victor. I thought it would be a good way to honor his legacy, to show respect for everything he did. It felt right." Victor's voice, however, was not warm with approval. "I don't know if that's what you were doing, Claire," he said, his tone heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "Your father didn't wear that medal to make a statement. He didn't wear it for recognition. He wore it because it meant something to him. A reminder of the men he lost, the things he sacrificed, the life he chose. It wasn't a fashion accessory, Claire." The words landed with a weight that was hard to ignore. "What do you mean, Victor?" she asked, trying to make sense of his response. I thought wearing it would show that I understood, that I had learned something real." Victor sighed, a sound heavy with both disappointment and understanding. "I know you're trying, Claire, but you can't wear your father's past like a costume. It doesn't work that way. What you're doing is cheapening what he and the others went through. You think you can simply put on authenticity, but it doesn't work like that. You need to earn it, live it. And you're not doing that, not by wearing a medal to a party. You're playing at something you don't understand." Claire was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Los Angeles skyline. Victor's words had pierced her deeply, but she couldn't fully grasp why it hurt so much. She had thought that by acknowledging her father's history, by wearing the medal and connecting herself to that history, she could finally bridge the gap between the world she had lived in and the world Albert had shown her. But now, Victor's voice echoed in her mind, and the truth was undeniable. She had misunderstood the lesson entirely. She had treated the medal as a symbol, as an easy shortcut to some kind of moral transformation, when it had never been about the symbol in the first place. Her phone call with Victor wasn't the only moment that made Claire confront the price she had paid. As the days passed, the disconnect between her outward persona and her internal world only grew wider. The people she had once called friends began to notice the change in her. They sensed that something was off, but Claire wasn't sure how to explain it. The casual conversations felt increasingly hollow. They continued to ask about her life, her latest endeavors, her social status, but the words felt empty. She had never felt so out of place among the people who once affirmed her every move. Claire's internal struggle reached a boiling point when she was invited to a private dinner with a group of influential people in the art world, a group she had long been eager to impress. They were discussing upcoming projects, high-end exhibitions, and the next big event, and as the conversation unfolded, Claire realized she had nothing to contribute. Her usual remarks about wealth, connections, and the right people to know seemed to fall flat. She was out of sync with their world, a world she had spent years navigating and dominating, but now, with a deepened sense of self-awareness, she saw the cracks in its foundation. The conversation turned to talk of history, of the war, of those who had sacrificed in ways Claire couldn't truly fathom, and suddenly, the medal hanging around her neck seemed absurd. She had thought it would bridge the gap, but instead, it only highlighted how much she had failed to understand the meaning behind it. After the dinner, as she walked out into the cool night air, Claire felt a wave of exhaustion settle over her. She had sought authenticity in the wrong places, through symbols, through gestures, through the very people who had long celebrated her for the wrong reasons. She had tried to make a statement by wearing the medal, but in doing so, she had only highlighted her own inadequacies. It wasn't the world of high society that had failed her. It was her own failure to truly connect, to truly change, to truly understand the weight of the things she had tried to represent. The price was steep, and Claire had finally come face to face with it. Her superficial approach to authenticity had cost her relationships, self-respect, and a sense of meaning. She had thought that the key to understanding her father's legacy, to understanding Albert's lessons, was something external, something she could perform, something she could wear like a costume. But the reality was far more painful. Authenticity required far more than outward displays. It required humility, understanding, and an honest reckoning with one's own limitations. As Claire sat alone in her apartment that night, staring at the gleaming skyline below her, she realized that the pursuit of approval, whether from her friends, society, or even herself, had only led her to deeper dissatisfaction. She had paid a heavy price for her attempt to play the role of someone she wasn't, and now she had no idea where to go from here. The external world she had once relied on for validation had lost its appeal, and the true lesson Albert had tried to impart seemed out of reach. She had wanted to be someone else, someone more noble, someone who embodied the values she had long admired. But in doing so, she had lost herself in the process. Claire's false victory, her attempt to change through outward gestures, had only deepened her internal struggle. And now, with the weight of her mistakes bearing down on her, she realized that the only way forward was through a deeper, more painful journey of self-understanding. She could no longer escape the truth that had been waiting for her all along. It had been a few weeks since the gala, and Claire could no longer ignore the weight of her internal transformation. Her friends still called, still invited her to their lavish parties, their art exhibitions, their charity galas. But the truth was, Claire no longer felt the same urgency to participate in those events. The world she had so thoroughly mastered, the world of influence, of wealth, of power, was no longer enough to sustain her. In fact, it had become a stage that felt increasingly false, a place where she no longer wanted to play a role. After the phone call with Victor Simmons, after the uncomfortable realizations that had followed, Claire had begun to withdraw. It wasn't a dramatic retreat, not a sweeping abandonment of the life she had known, but a slow and deliberate distancing. She had once believed that her identity was tied to her success, to the way people saw her, to the things she could display, her wealth, her taste, her connections. But now, she felt an almost painful disconnect from all of it. She had sought authenticity through external means, through the symbol of the medal, through carefully curated gestures of respect, and had only come to realize that true authenticity was not something you could wear. It was something you had to live. And that was something Claire hadn't yet fully understood. The days following her realization were marked by deep reflection. Claire spent hours walking along the streets of Los Angeles, where the glittering skylines seemed less bright, less inviting. She visited Albert again, this time without any expectation of what she might gain from the experience. She no longer sought some grand lesson or external validation. She simply wanted to be in the presence of a man who had lived with integrity, who had found a way to reconcile sacrifice and honor with the quiet moments of his life. It was during these visits that Claire began to see what she had been missing all along. Albert, for all his humility, never saw the world the way she had. His understanding of honor wasn't rooted in a need for recognition or social status. It wasn't about making a statement or wearing a symbol that would impress others. Albert had lived a life where the choices he made were based on the truth of who he was, not what others thought of him. He was content in his simplicity, in his ability to hold his beliefs without seeking approval. His life was a quiet testimony to the power of living with purpose, with sacrifice, and with a deep respect for the things that truly mattered. As Claire spent more time with Albert, she began to understand what it meant to live authentically. It wasn't about seeking validation from others, nor was it about displaying a particular image of oneself to the world. Authenticity, she realized, was a deep and personal process, a continual reckoning with your values, your choices, and your relationship to the world around you. It was about having the courage to act in alignment with your beliefs, even when those actions didn't bring external rewards. It was about standing firm in the face of temptation, of comfort, and of the pressures of societal expectations. This understanding did not come easily, nor was it something that Claire could embrace overnight. She struggled with the notion of letting go of the life she had known, the life that had granted her so much power and influence. But over time, she started to notice small changes in herself. She found herself caring less about the approval of her peers and more about the choices she made in the quiet moments when no one was watching. It wasn't that she rejected her old life entirely. Rather, she began to see it with new eyes. The world she had inhabited was no longer something to be conquered or dominated. It was a space where she could live with intention, a place where her actions could align with her values rather than her need for validation. Claire's return to her social circles was inevitable. She attended events, met with old friends, and continued to engage with her world. But now, there was a noticeable shift. At first, her friends seemed to notice that something was different about her. She was less eager to participate in the petty gossip, less interested in impressing others with her accomplishments. She no longer saw herself as part of a game that needed to be won. Instead, she focused on engaging with people in a more meaningful way, asking questions, listening deeply, and offering her true self in conversation rather than the mask she had once worn. The first time Claire went to a party after her internal shift, she felt the difference immediately. The conversation was as shallow as always, but for the first time, she didn't feel the need to join in. She observed her friends talking about their latest achievements, their new purchases, their glamorous vacations, and yet, she felt an almost serene detachment. She didn't have to prove herself anymore. She didn't have to keep up with the facade. The need to impress had evaporated, and in its place was a quiet confidence that she hadn't known before. This change did not come without its challenges. Some of her friends, those who had only known the old Claire, the one who was always in the spotlight, always striving for more, were confused by her new demeanor. They tried to draw her into their old conversations, tried to bring her back into the fold of superficiality. But Claire was firm in her resolve. She could no longer play along with the games they played. She could no longer pretend that the things they cared about mattered in the way they once had. There were moments when the pressure to conform was overwhelming, but Claire had a new sense of clarity. She could step away from the need to belong, and instead, she chose to focus on the people who appreciated her for who she had become, not for the persona she had once projected. One afternoon, while having tea with a small group of friends, Claire had a conversation that marked a turning point. Her friend Laura, someone she had known for years and had always admired for her intelligence, asked her a simple question. "What happened to you, Claire? You've changed." At first, Claire wasn't sure how to respond. She could feel the weight of the question, and she knew that any answer she gave would require vulnerability. But for the first time, Claire was willing to share her truth. "I've learned something," she said softly. "I've learned that the things I used to care about, status, recognition, the need to be admired, none of that really matters. What matters is living a life that's true to who you are, not to what others expect of you." Laura was silent for a moment, processing what Claire had said. Then she nodded. "That's powerful, Claire. I don't think I could ever give up the life I've built. But I get it. I think I'm starting to see what you mean." It wasn't a grand epiphany, nor did it instantly transform the way Claire's circle saw her, but for the first time, Claire felt at peace with who she was. She was no longer trying to prove something to anyone. She had made the choice to live with authenticity, to focus on her own values rather than the external rewards that once defined her. And in doing so, she had found a quiet strength, a new sense of purpose. But perhaps the most profound change came when Claire revisited Albert, weeks after their last meeting. She found him sitting on the porch of his modest home, his eyes following the path of the setting sun. When she sat beside him, he looked at her with a quiet smile. "You've changed, Claire," he said simply. There was no judgment in his voice, only a deep understanding. "I can see it in the way you carry yourself now. It's not about the medal or the parties. It's about the way you live your life, day by day." For the first time, Claire felt that Albert truly saw her, not as a young woman struggling to prove herself, but as someone who had begun to understand what it meant to live with dignity, to live with purpose, and to live with authenticity. As she left Albert's house that afternoon, Claire realized something profound. Her journey wasn't about the world around her. It was about the transformation that had taken place within her. The real victory wasn't in the approval of others, or in the medals, or in the social status she had once coveted. The real victory was in her newfound understanding of herself. She had let go of the need to prove her worth through external validation and had started to build a life based on her own internal compass. This was the change that mattered. And as she walked away from Albert's home, the sun setting gently over the horizon, Claire knew that she was finally free. Free to be herself, free to live authentically, and free to create a life that was true to her own heart. It wasn't a life of perfection, and it wasn't a life without challenges, but it was hers, and that was enough.
Disclaimer. This channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.